Picking the worst pope in history is surprisingly difficult, my friends. Not because they were all saints, but because the competition is just so stiff. Forget your average workplace drama. The Vatican has seen plots and scandals that would make a soap opera blush. So grab your holy water and buckle up, because today we're digging through the dirtiest laundry in all of Christendom. Now, with nearly 300 popes stretching back 2,000 years, there's a lot of candidates to choose from and plenty of sins of which they are guilty. But this leads us to a tricky question. What does it mean to be the worst pope? Do we judge our candidates by the sheer scale of their personal depravity, or by their catastrophic political blunders, or perhaps by the lasting damage they inflicted on the Catholic Church itself? To be clear, there are strong contenders in each category. We have your garden variety sexual deviancy, venerable heaps of abuse and murder, and the odd heresy here and there. So to make the cut in this ranking, popes had to have performed some truly vile acts. Perhaps the vilest was committed towards the end of the 9th century by Pope Stephen VI. Unlike most other popes in this list, he wasn't known for his debauchery, but rather for his cruelty. He was a bitter enemy of his predecessor, Pope Formosus. So, after becoming pope, Stephen called together a special synod to judge his already dead arch-nemesis. He dug up Formosus's corpse, put it on trial, and after it failed to defend itself against the levied accusations, found it guilty. He then cut off Formosus's fingers and threw whatever was left of him into the Tiber River. This wasn't the end of this ghastly ordeal, though, since Formosus's corpse washed up ashore and supposedly healed the fisherman who retrieved it. Before long, the whole of Rome was up in arms, and Pope Stephen was deposed, imprisoned, and finally strangled, a very fitting end for the man who we here at SideQuest award as the cruelest pope. If we swing in the other direction, however, we can find a very long list of popes who did not shy away from enjoying the finer pleasures of life. As we all know, the Catholic Church enforces a strict law of celibacy upon its clerics. But what happens when the man at the top stops practicing what he should preach? We get a pope like John XII, who took up the reins of the papacy at the ripe old age of 18. He came from a powerful family of Roman nobles and had already acquired a taste for fine wine and finer women by the time his father secured his election as pope. The new job title didn't sober him up. In fact, he turned the Lateran Palace into a brothel that housed more mistresses than it did ministers. John racked up large debts by gambling and hosting feast after feast for his family and lovers, two groups that sometimes overlapped. In some legends, the papacy was actually said to have been run by one of his mistresses, a woman named Joan, which is a curious story that we covered in another SideQuest from way back when. In any case, John's scandalous pontificate lasted nearly a full decade before his sins finally caught up to him. As the story goes, a nobleman found John bedding his wife and proceeded to beat the Pope so badly that he perished from his wounds a few days later. But while John XII's papacy was perhaps the lewdest of them all, which, to be clear, is a very closely contested race, another pope desecrated the institution in a very different way. Allow me to bring to your attention Pope Benedict IX, who, according to some historians, beats John by just a few years to claim the title of youngest pope in history, having been elected when he was just 12. Benedict was, in fact, the grandnephew of John XII and the nephew of the immediately preceding pope. As befits his outrageous family, Benedict's reign was spicy from the start, with his father having secured his election through bribery. While not quite as sexually prolific, his rule routinely featured torture, robbery, and murder. And after 12 painfully long years, the Romans finally got sick of him and forced him out. Not one to go down without a fight, Benedict returned 6 months later with an army at his back. becoming the first pope in history to be elected more than once after he deposed his short-lived successor. A mere 2 months later, however, Benedict had a sudden realization that his cousin was extremely attractive and that he wanted to give up the papacy so that he could marry her. The rapidly deteriorating political situation in Rome probably also helped with his decision. But Benedict, being the smart lad that he was, didn't just abdicate his position as pope. No. In order to set himself and his sweetheart up with a nice cozy retirement in Alban Hills, he decided to sell it. And so, on the 1st of May 1045, Benedict became the first and only pope to sell the papacy to his godfather for £1,000 of silver. This proved to be a timely exit, as the very next year, the Holy Roman Emperor finally had had enough of these pontifical shenanigans and crossed the Alps to restore order. He had Benedict's godfather deposed and installed a German pope in Rome, which should have been the end of this story. But Benedict just didn't know when to quit, so he waited patiently for the new pope to expire from natural causes before making a third grab at the papacy. This final pontificate lasted just over 6 months before the Germans definitively kicked him out into relative obscurity. We know that Benedict died no later than 1056, supposedly repentant, but we'll probably never know for sure. Yet, while Benedict did a good job of ruining Rome's political stability for a good 2 decades, we can look towards the early 16th century for the Pope who arguably dealt the most damage to the Catholic Church as a whole. But speaking of dealing damage, you can partake in massive damage dealing on the high seas with today's sponsor, World of Warships Legends. Command great, historically accurate warships from 11 different nations in this fierce naval game of strategy and cunning. You can play with your friends across PlayStation, Xbox and mobile, engaging in epic 9v9 battles or 12-player battle royales across more than 20 different maps. More content and ships get added every month, from nimble destroyers to impenetrable battleships, so the excitement never stops. World of Warships Legends has already amassed over 8 million players, and now is the best time to join with the game's new 4th of July update. It has a ton of new American-themed content, including the legendary tier Louisiana battleship with monstrous 406mm guns and deadly torpedo airstrikes. You can earn all sorts of rewards during this limited-time event, from unique camouflages to the powerhouse legendary cruiser Puerto Rico. So, if you want to experience the full thrill of naval combat and to deal some serious naval damage, download World of Warships Legends for free by clicking on the link in the description. Now, back to a different kind of damage, the kind inflicted on the Catholic Church. The man who dealt it is Pope Leo X, who hailed from the stupendously wealthy Florentine banking family, the Medici. What was even more stupendous was Leo's profligate spending. Despite his own personal wealth and the papacy's worldwide income, he managed to drain the Catholic Church's coffers dry. He fought costly wars in Italy to carve out kingdoms for his brother and nephew, even diverting funds from a planned crusade against the Ottoman Turks. Now, to Leo's credit, some of his exorbitant spending did go towards the arts. He sponsored some of Raphael's most famous paintings, commissioned many sculptures from Michelangelo, and even partially rebuilt St. Peter's Basilica. To pay for all this, Pope Leo had to resort to some truly desperate measures, like pawning off the papal jewels and the Vatican's furniture. But by far, his greatest feat of financial wizardry was his widespread sale of indulgences. To be clear, the concept of paying the church for salvation predates Leo by several centuries, yet he took the idea and turned it into a fat and luscious cash cow. Leo sold indulgences all across Europe, from Portugal to Sweden, but especially in Germany, raking in vast sums of money that nevertheless vanished from papal coffers as quickly as they appeared. The Germans quickly caught on that their tithes weren't going where they were supposed to, and in 1517, Martin Luther wrote 95 theses against Pope Leo and his corrupt indulgences. Pope Leo had just concluded a council pushing for reform, so he was in no mood to change his indulgence practices. In fact, he intensified them in the years that followed and branded Martin Luther as a heretic. Before long, Luther was preaching his own brand of Christianity, and the Protestant Reformation was in full swing, precisely in the territories where Leo had peddled his indulgences the most. The worst part is that all the indulgences were ultimately for nothing, as upon his death in December 1521, Leo left the papacy in more debt than it had ever been up to that point. So, through his unbridled greed, Pope Leo precipitated the greatest schism in the history of the Catholic Church, far beyond the damage any other pope managed to inflict. Now, you'll notice that one pope keeps coming up with the silver medals in our unholy ranking, Alexander VI, also known as Rodrigo Borgia. His spicy story touches on almost all the sins we've covered so far, and while he didn't truly excel in any category, his story is nevertheless so interesting that we might just cover it in another one of our pontifical side quests. But until then, my friends, I hope you'll send your prayers, and perhaps an indulgence or two on our Patreon. Stay blessed and stay tuned for the next sanctimoniously transactional episode of SideQuest. How does the Pope make holy water? He boils the hell out of it.